More than a century ago, a company called Calum helped Jacksonville become the winter film capital of the world, a reputation that lasted only a decade. Hear the fascinating true story on Bygone Jacks, Our Unsung History, a podcast from WJCT Public Media.
Sing Out Loud Festival presents the Live Wildly Showcase with Noah Kahn, Eric Church, Nora Jones, JJ Gray and Mofro, and more. September 21st and 22nd in downtown St. Augustine. More information at singoutloudfestival.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Ahead in the next 5 minutes, live local news for the First Coast from the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, help for families living with the strain of unsolved homicides. We talk with the organizers behind the 3rd annual Cold Case Symposium at UNF. Then, Clay County's election supervisor castigates residents for lackluster voter turnout. We ask him what he hopes his message achieves and how he's preparing for the November presidential election. And a Nassau County theater brings a classic Nora Ephron play to life in honor of breast cancer awareness. You can join the conversation on air by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org or reach out on social media. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News, I'm Corva Coleman. Labor Day traditionally marks the true start of a presidential campaign, but in this election, which has been going on for nearly 2 years, NPR's Domenico Montanaro reports it represents the beginning of the final sprint.
62 days, that's all that's left until Election Day, but people start voting in just a matter of weeks. Vice President Kamala Harris has made up significant ground in the polls and is now narrowly ahead in many places, but those leads are all within the margin of error, and this election is expected to be very close. Former President Trump is ramping up attacks on Harris, trying to drag her down, so expect this race to get even uglier. That'll be a test for Harris, but both Harris and Trump face challenges in exactly 1 week when they square off in their first debate. Domenico Montanaro, NPR News, Washington.
Ukraine's president says Russia has fired 2 ballistic missiles into central Ukraine today. Writing online, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says at least 41 people were killed when the missiles hit a military training facility and a hospital. Another 180 people have been wounded. It appears to be one of the deadliest strikes since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. Russian President Vladimir Putin is visiting neighboring Mongolia. That country is standing up to pressure to arrest him. NPR's John Ruwich reports it follows an international criminal court warrant issued last year.
The trip to Mongolia is Putin's first to a member state of the International Criminal Court since he was charged with war crimes by the court in March 2023. Under ICC rules, member states have an obligation to detain people wanted by the court. Several human rights organizations urged Mongolia to arrest the Russian leader, as did Ukraine, which said the failure to do so was a heavy blow to the international criminal law system. But a photo of Putin arriving in Mongolia on Monday night showed him walking on a red carpet with the country's foreign minister, flanked by a Mongolian honor guard. The two countries have long enjoyed close relations. Putin is wanted by the ICC for alleged war crimes around the unlawful deportation of children from Ukraine. John Ruwich, NPR News.
The U.S. government has seized the official plane of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. This comes as Maduro continues to insist that he won re-election in July, a claim rejected by international observers, the U.S., and the Venezuelan opposition. Reporter Manuel Rueda has been following developments from neighboring Colombia. He says U.S. officials claim Maduro got the plane through a straw purchase made in Florida.
I think with this plane being confiscated, the Biden administration is trying to sort of show its teeth and signal to the Maduro government that they're serious about enforcing sanctions against the Venezuelan government, which could be sanctions over more serious issues eventually, such as oil projects in Venezuela, Venezuelan oil exports.
Rueda spoke to NPR's Morning Edition. This is NPR.
At 4 minutes after 9 o'clock, this is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. The State Road Department has launched an anti-littering campaign in Jacksonville. It's called Litter Less, Live More. The month-long campaign specifically aims to combat littering in Duval County alone, plus alert drivers to the safety hazards posed by litter on transportation corridors, waterways, and green spaces. Here's FDOT spokesman Hampton Ray.
There's a safety element, there's an environmental element, as well as an economic reality. That when we have tons of trash on the road, it pollutes our rivers, it pollutes, our drainage system, it clogs up the drainage system, as well as there's an economic reality. Somebody has to go out there and clean it.
In fact, Ray says that the tonnage of trash removed from Jacksonville interstates last year was 39% greater than that removed from busy Broward County. That's everything from couches and wood that fell off trailers to fast food wrappers thrown out of windows. Tomorrow, the St. Johns County Clerk's Office will host a workshop for people to understand the legal ins and outs of divorce, child custody, and more. The free family law workshop will help provide people with the resources to represent themselves and make informed decisions when navigating the legal system. And that workshop is at noon tomorrow at Richard O. Watson Judicial Center. Temperature now is 79 degrees. Rain today.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include EBSCO, supporting open source technology and making open platforms possible for libraries of all sizes. Learn more at ebsco.com. And listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, an annual event brings together researchers, survivors, and law enforcement experts to help those living with unsolved homicides. Later in the program, why a local official is chastising voters for abysmal election turnout. But first, for survivors who've lost someone in a cold case crime, feelings of grief, rage, and injustice are experienced across an interminable timeline. For that reason, it's a community with a special need for connections and resources. Nobody knows this better than Ryan Backmann, one of those survivors. He's also founder and CEO of Jacksonville-based Project Cold Case. Hi, Ryan.
Hi, Ann. How are you?
Very good. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
We're also joined by retired federal law enforcement officer and crime safety analyst, Mark Baughman, who serves on the Project Cold Case board. Hi, Mark.
Good morning, Ann.
Good to have you.
Thank
Ryan,
you.
I'll begin, if you're okay with it, asking about whether there's any news on your father's murder.
There is not. But I say that because JSO did actually try to look back into it earlier this year, sent off some of the evidence for advanced testing. Unfortunately, no results. So we still have no suspects. And kind of one of those, when you're dealing with cold cases, it's kind of a never-ending perpetual cycle of hope and despair. And, I had the hope and I was at the peak. And the detective came into my office, sat down with me and explained everything that they had done and all the people that had contributed. They used a grant from another nonprofit. They used a private lab down in South Florida. Sat down with DNA analysts at the state crime lab. Everybody got together and really tried one more time to resolve my dad's case. And unfortunately, the results were negative.
There's something in your signature on your email about hope in the face of hopelessness. And in these cases, like your father's murder, which was, remind us, that was in 2009.
Yeah,
and he
15 years in October.
Just 56 years old,
Yeah.
on a construction site, and he was shot in the back during a robbery?
Correct. Yeah, it was a robbery. He was there by himself working on a newly renovated office building. And it was a Saturday. It was a side job for him. He was actually trying to make a few extra dollars for my stepmom, who was suffering from terminal cancer. And somebody walked in, shot him, took his wallet, and left. My dad lived long enough to call 911. Gave a description, a very vague description of the guy. He didn't know him. and then lost consciousness on the phone with the dispatcher and was pronounced deceased at the hospital.
So I'm so sorry about that. This was at Phillips Highway and
Yeah, it's JTB 295 and Phillips Highway in between there, where the Applebee's and the Cracker Barrel and all of that is. There's a roundabout there on Bonneville Road that had one-story brick office buildings, and that's where my dad was on a Saturday afternoon, just after noon on a Saturday.
And it's worth revisiting those details because a lot of these cold cases really do depend on maybe somebody who knows something coming forward at some point and saying, telling police what they know.
Absolutely, and specifically in my dad's case, where so much has been done and so much work and effort has gone into it, I think we really are going to have to rely on somebody coming forward, unfortunately.
And Mark, you worked in law enforcement for multiple agencies, state, federal, local. What drew you to this kind of advocacy in terms of working with Project Cold Case?
Because usually in law enforcement, when you start investigating something, you have a tendency to forget about the victim or the victim's families, how impactful it is towards everybody who's related to that particular victim. And that's not intentional. You're doing a job and you're trying to get to, figure out who did this. Statistically, at least with homicides, 1 in every 5 homicides, the victim knows the suspect. In this case, that's not the case with Ryan. You have 4 other ones out there that you wouldn't have known this individual that came up and took his life. And law enforcement, for me, getting involved in it now is looking and actually speaking to some of the family members, because I have, to see what they're still going through, dealing with it. Ryan always says it's not closure for these people. Even if they are solved, it's still not closure.
How does a case like this impact a family different than a case that is solved, to your point?
Well, I think it's they still have hope that it's going to happen, that maybe something where some investigative technique is being used, primarily DNA analysis, stuff like that will come forward, and then all of a sudden they have a suspect, and then they charge somebody, hopefully. If that individual is even alive, some of these cases go so far back, people are incarcerated, they're already gone, which we've seen that happen a lot with some of the cases that have been solved.
And I think in my experience, it's this journey of healing with grief. And I think that it's just a layer of complexity when you don't know who did it. There's a layer of complexity because it was violence that took your loved one, that was sudden. There's all these, grief is grief and we all experience it, but then there's layers of complexity depending on your relationship with somebody, the age, whether it was sudden, whether it was violent, and then whether anybody's ever held accountable.
Mm-hmm. So what sort of special support do you find victims need when they're involved in a cold case?
Communication. They need to be heard. They want to share their loved one's story. The biggest fear is that our loved one is forgotten and that nobody cares. And that's why I started Project Cold Case. It was an opportunity to let all those families know that somebody did care and that their loved one would never be forgotten. We'll put their picture on a website. We'll share their story. We'll repeatedly share their story in hopes that, obviously the ultimate goal is that somebody will see it, have information, and come forward. But even if we don't have that, we're providing that peer support. We have professional services that provide therapy and mental health counseling. We do 2 support groups a month for these families, one in person and one virtually, so they don't even have to be local if they want to be around other family members that have experienced something similar. And I think a lot of times that's what they need more so than an arrest. They may not know that or realize that, but more than an arrest and a conviction is knowing that their loved one mattered, that there's other people around that care.
I was just going to say that I saw 2 families talking. Both of them had lost loved ones. Crime's not solved, but the emotions that they go through are so similar that unless you're that person going through it, you don't understand it.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, we are talking about cold case resources for survivors of unsolved homicides. You can join our conversation on air by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. Ryan, you talk about keeping these cases front and center, and that is important for families who don't want their loved one forgotten. But talk a little bit about the balance between having a case out there in the format like you provide and then the challenges that can come with whether it's true crime documentaries or podcasts or online sleuthing
Right.
sites that can sometimes feel maybe a little exploitative.
Absolutely. We very much are family participation. So what our job is to provide these families with what they need. And if they need awareness and they need the world to see their loved one, then we want to help them achieve that. But if they don't want that, and we just had this in a situation recently where production company reached out and said, "Hey, we're doing this story. Will the family participate?" And the family said, "No, we don't want to participate. And actually, we don't want you to do the story. Like, we're healing in our own way, and we don't want to turn on the TV and see our loved one and talk about it." And the production company said, "Well, we'll take that into consideration." And I just feel like, a family should have say in what is talked about with their loved one, how much awareness and publicity they get. And that's what we give them. We give them back a little control. So when you lose a loved one to a homicide, you're stripped of all of that control. You don't get to decide whether the detective is 3 weeks from retiring, whether he's a bulldog or she's a bulldog. You don't get to decide if the physical evidence is left at the scene. You don't get to decide if technology is advanced enough to utilize that evidence. A lot of times you don't get information from law enforcement because they're doing an investigation, and you really are stripped of all that control. And so we want to give a little bit of that back. So when we do a spotlight, and we partner with the University of North Florida's applied journalism class, every semester we go out and present our experiences with media, and we hand out cases to students who then call the family who has already approved this and wants to be a part of it. And they interview the family, and we talk about the victim's life. Oftentimes these victims are defined by their last moments on earth. And like my dad, there was 56 years of life that we could talk about, but the story is how he died.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want the rest of the public to be able to connect with these victims by learning what their favorite holiday was, what their favorite food was, what was a funny story that somebody might relate to, and we really want to humanize these victims, that they're not just another number, that they're not just a demographic, that these are real people who had families that loved them and are sorely missed.
Yeah. And that they're not just remembered by the worst, most violent thing
Right.
that happened to them. Do you offer advice to families who are caught in that predicament? Is there any suggestion, any template that you have when they're confronted by or even just asked by a production company to participate in something?
Yeah, we do. First and foremost is, have you listened to their prior work, watched their prior work, and is the family involved? Because that's number one. At the end of the day, you want families that are engaged.
You mean the production company?
The production company and law enforcement. The reality is you don't want to say something that could jeopardize a future prosecution of a case. You want to make sure that there's facts. A lot of times in unsolved cases, we create scenarios in our head because nobody's given us the information. And so you don't want to say something that didn't actually happen, but it's now your truth because you believed it. You've thought of it. And I speak from personal experience of this. I did an interview where I made a comment about what I thought happened. And the detective called me and was like, "Where did you get that information? That's not what happened." This was early on in the investigation, but in my mind, that was the only thing that made sense. And so I went with it, but I was quoted as fact. This is what happened, and now that story still lives out there on the internet somewhere,
And to that point, Ryan, when you have somebody like a production company coming in wanting to do this, the fact that Project Cold Case can put that investigative who has the case now or may have it from when it's first started, put that with the family, and the family could say, "Do you think we ought to do this or not do this?"
Right.
That this is, I don't want to do anything to ever jeopardize or hurt the case in getting some resolution or solving it.
There can be tension, though, Mark, as you know from law enforcement. Families are eager for information. Very often there is almost no information available. They'll maybe learn the facts of the case through the media sometimes, because the media will be the ones requesting the discovery in a case. The media will be the ones attending, each and every hearing that perhaps family doesn't choose to be at. And so they want this information, but very often they're in this kind of standoff with the detectives on the case.
That's true. And unfortunately, I investigatively, I can understand why the detectives take the position they take, but I can also look at the other side of it and say the frustration of the family members that are wanting to know whatever they're doing, whatever is being developed. You remember, these cases, they go on for years and years and years. You may have 4 or 5 detectives to pick up this case. and they go back and have to look at it. And maybe even the detective that first had it may not even be living anymore.
Right.
So now you're like having to piece it together and go back. It's good and it's bad because fresh eyes get to look at this case, and they may see something with it that somebody else didn't see prior to that.
But they also don't know the case inside and out, right? They're just starting anew.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Every day that goes by, it makes it that much harder, to solve these old cases for just the reasons you're talking about.
Well, so I was going to ask you, it seems like sometimes every day that goes by, it gets harder to solve a case when it's hot. But once it's cold, it does seem that there's this period where perhaps people, a marriage breaks up and somebody's willing to testify or to tell what they know, or a relationship ends and they're now in a position where they feel like they can tell the truth.
Well, that and technology is moving at lightning speed. So there is opportunities, but you have to prioritize cold cases. So a lot of times in law enforcement, it's not prioritized. Remember last time I was here, we were talking about that bill we were trying to pass in Tallahassee that prioritized cold cases across the state. And there are many agencies that do prioritize them, but there are just as many and maybe more that don't prioritize. And they say they don't have the resources or the means to go back and just open a case file and see what physical evidence, whether there's new technology, or go back to an old witness that maybe had a change in relationship and might be willing to talk now. That takes manpower.
And so we should just catch people up. That was the Decker-Backmann Act, name and part for you.
Yeah.
It failed. It passed unanimously in the Criminal Justice Subcommittee, but when it got to appropriations, it died there.
Yeah.
And I think probably because there were questions about the cost of prioritizing these cases, and also the fact that it would allow families to trigger a new review, which perhaps some law enforcement officials were not keen on.
Exactly. And I think they're going to move forward with that bill. I'm going to request that they take my dad's name off of it. It's never been about me or my dad, and quite honestly, it was devastating to me that the people that I have built relationships with over the last 15 years, who were privately telling me that they supported it, then publicly wouldn't stand up for it. And it was devastating. And I really struggled with that. And I struggled that the people that had the power didn't use it for good. And I don't need another reminder that people don't care about my dad. Like I live it, and that was an opportunity for people, particularly elected officials and people in a position of power, to show that they cared about my dad. And they showed me that they don't. And look, that's why Project Cold Case exists, because we knew that going in. And we give opportunity after opportunity after opportunity for elected officials to show us differently. And some of them do. I'm not blanketing. We have a great relationship with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. Again, I told you that they went back, without telling me, they went back and reopened my dad's case. They grabbed every resource possible. They prioritize cold cases. They're open to communication. They have a great team down there that answers the phone and returns calls. But there are other agencies that don't share that. And certainly when you have to pass legislation to get people to care, that's probably the first problem. But then when they have that opportunity and they won't even put it on the agenda in Tallahassee, there's things going on in the background, and it's impacting real families, that are struggling and struggling to work, to be, productive members of society, to get up every day, to put their clothes on, to go to church, to support their families. There are deep impacts with violence and grief and victimization that are often forgotten. I won't say always ignored, but they're often forgotten.
We're talking about cold case victims and survivors and resources that are available to them. It's ahead of a symposium that's going to be held at the University of North Florida. You can join our conversation by calling 904-549-2937, or you can email questions or comments to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. Mark, you and I have spoken in the past about a number of cases where it almost seemed unsolvable. These cases that in the end ended up having a resolution, which in many cases really remarkable. The Kamaya Mobley case, who was kidnapped as a day-old infant, and the case solved 18 years later after her abduction. The murder, as you well know, of Saad Quaff, who was a convenience store owner, ended up learning just a few years ago that he was murdered by the JSO detective that was surveilling him, who'd retired at that point. But these are cases that decades later are solved and resolved. The family gets some relief from that.
Absolutely, they do. And in both instances, the family did get some relief from it. You know, I was familiar with both of those cases from a media standpoint and from knowing the suspect in the other case because I worked with him.
Billy Bear.
Billy Bear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, he was in JSO intelligence at the time. I would have to be working with DEA, and we crossed paths on occasion, and that particular incident leading up to it. So, yeah, it's shocking. I just want to throw one more thing out here. You see these datelines, you see these 48 hours, you see this. I think people get some unrealistic expectations as to how quickly these may or may not be solved. They're interesting shows, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, we deal in a real world with real facts. You know, you take Ryan's father's case to go back to it. If you go out to do a neighborhood canvas out there now, that landscape's all changed. There's no one to talk to out there anymore. You're relying. Your investigative leads start narrowing as time goes on,
And depend a lot on that initial legwork that was done, right? So if the officers are going out and canvassing and taking note of each and every person that they speak to, perhaps they could be reached years later. But if that work isn't done at the front end, you really are left without options.
Absolutely. And if it's not documented appropriately, like a lot of times case files, for whatever reason, those interviews, they may have talked to somebody, but no one put it to paper. And if you did memorialize it and later on the case goes by and they go, hey, the detective came here and talked to me like when this first happened. When you go back and look in the file and it's not there.
I want to ask you about the legislative process overall, Ryan, because we talked about the act that had your father's name on it that didn't pass, but there have been these additional changes. Rape kit retention now is going to have to be required for 50 years, which is a big improvement. Right. When we talk about the changes in DNA technology advancing, there have been there's a cold case now squad, I guess, at the state level, a cold case unit that's been created. So there has been some movement. Where would you describe the overall trajectory?
I think we're slowly heading in the right direction, but if you go back to the rape kit and the SACI sexual assault kit initiative, it took realizing that was a failure, right? That we were putting these kits in closets and not testing them for decades.
Or ever.
And somebody realized that was wrong, right? And so they fixed it. And that's what we're trying to do with the cold case. Like, these cases are important. They should be prioritized just like the rape kits were prioritized, just like human trafficking is prioritized. You know, in the advocacy world, where it's always kind of the crime of the day, like what's the most important popular victimization right now? And we see it on a national level. And cold cases have never had that. They're popular in that true crime realm of entertainment, right? Like, but where it's just a portion of what happened in a very quick story and then hopefully a resolution. You know, we have over 60 cases that have been resolved that have been on our website. But we have 1,600 cases on our website. So, you know, the vast majority of the people we are helping are not the ones that have those answers and resolution. They're the ones trying to get there, or at least trying to have joy in their life again as they're moving through this journey. And so it's difficult, and we just want our turn to be prioritized.
Yeah. We have a call from AJ from Mad Dads. Good morning, AJ. Go ahead.
Good morning. Good morning, Ryan, and to the other guests.
Hey,
I have
AJ.
a question for good morning. I have a question for you, Ryan. Sometimes we get phone calls from Mad Dads, and families want to know what are some of the steps they can take to get their cold cases looked at. If you maybe could just explain that a little bit to the families that may be listening.
Absolutely. And thank you, AJ. AJ is a good friend, and Mad Dads is an amazing organization. There are resources out here in Jacksonville for families that are struggling. We take very much a proactive stance with families to get your case reopened. And that is, number one, when's the last time you talked to law enforcement? And a lot of them have not spoken to law enforcement in a long time. A lot of times the detective has changed, retired, promoted, transferred. But we promote reaching out, reestablishing communication with law enforcement and just asking them. Most agencies will pull the file off the shelf and take a look and see, is there evidence that hasn't been tested in a long time? Is there a witness we can talk to? JSO does an amazing job of this. If you call that station right now, I can tell you the detective is going to answer the phone because he answers every call, and every family calls us back and says, well, I just talked to the detective, and I won't out him on the air, but I just talked to Detective so-and-so, and he's going to look at my loved one's case. And that's what we ask. Expectations need to be realistic. You're not going to solve every case when you call and ask them to take another look at it. But we will walk with them and what questions to ask, how to ask them, and how to approach that to at least get that first step moving.
How do you tell them to negotiate that relationship, though? I mean, you want them to be a vigorous advocate, but you also don't want them to be an irritant or a public critic, perhaps, of a case that's still pending.
Our position is always, to work hand in hand with law enforcement. And if you have to hold them accountable, right? Like as long as if they're doing what they're supposed to do, everybody's going to, you may not get a resolution, but we have respectful communication. And that means returning a phone call, returning an email, giving an update, right? From a law enforcement perspective. And if you're a family, we have to realize that bringing the case up to today's standards is our goal. And we hope that it gets resolved by bringing it up. But every case on the shelf needs to be looked at and figured out if there's new technology that can be applied to it, if there's old witnesses that can be interviewed. And as long as an agency is doing that, that's really all we can ask. You will resolve cases that way.
The other thing is investigators do their victimology. They want to know everything about the victim as much as they can. Well, who's going to know that most about the victim? The family that's left behind. If they can put that together with law enforcement has that dialogue with the family's engaged, they can keep coming back and asking questions. And for just what AJ was asking is that if for some reason with mad dads and the people out there that are grieving over loss of a loved one can say, hey, by the way, my son, my daughter, whatever, goes back to law enforcement as long as in saying this may help in some manner. Ryan has created that connectivity, or Project Cold Case has created that connectivity in that manner.
In terms of advances in technology, there's one speaker that's going to be at this symposium, Anne Marie Schubert. She is the district attorney in Sacramento. She prosecuted the Golden State Killer using genetic genealogy. That was a real game changer. I don't know that that was the first case that incorporated genetic genealogy, but it certainly was kind of the biggest, newest one when it happened. And that has changed the way that law enforcement approaches the capture of DNA. They don't necessarily need a direct sample. They can find somebody through a family tree.
I think they did that in the Billy Bear case with the
they did. Side Coif was genealogy.
It was genealogy.
That was JSO using genetic genealogy, but it was
they used that
based on the Golden State Killer case.
Yeah, and that has really broadened what they're capable of doing. Is that right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's kind of the biggest breakthrough in forensic advancement since DNA, right? I mean, it opens up all of these avenues, and this is why communication is so important. So we get calls from families. How come whatever agency is not using, genetic genealogy on my loved one's case? And then we say, well, do you know if they have suspect DNA? And a lot of times the families don't know what evidence is in an investigation, but that's a great opportunity to call the law enforcement agency, schedule an appointment, and ask, right? And say, does my loved one's case fit the criteria for forensic investigative genetic genealogy? It's a great way to start the conversation.
There is a DNA case that was recently solved here, Ryan, that was really extraordinary. It was a terrible case when it happened. A woman who was kidnapped on Christmas Eve in 1985 and raped and murdered. And that case went cold for years.
Yeah, 30 plus years. Leslie McRae and her family reached out to us. And tragic story. Her mother had ALS, but submitted the case to our organization. When we called her back, she couldn't communicate verbally. She was older, ALS. She could text like a teenager, but she could not talk on the phone. And that was a real struggle. So there was another family member that kind of became the point of contact. And if that family, through like a little bit of our help in guiding them and telling them what to ask, we advocated with them for 5 years. And a lot of people looked at us and were like, wow, 5 years you worked with this family. But the family had gone like 34 years waiting for answers and had nobody supporting them for all that time before. And that's, I think, one of the things I'm most proud of about Project Cold Case is that we provide that long-term support. Once we are part of their family, once we're, working with them, we're not going anywhere. We're not going to say, okay, there's nothing they can do now, bye. We're going to keep up with them and provide them, hey, there's new technology. Hey, let's do an awareness campaign. Let's put a billboard up. Let's try anything we can, to just keep the information out there and keep the person that did this seeing, that face over and over and over again. And, you never know what'll happen.
In this case, the DNA that was captured in the crime scene was retested. Is that right? And this
That's correct.
suspect
And
was already in custody.
This goes to my whole theory that communication with family and law enforcement and maintaining that. I know there's certain things that law enforcement can't share with the family, but the more time that goes by, I think the more you can share. And the family had no idea that in the early 2000s that DNA had been collected, had been tested, and a partial profile had been created and was running in the state database, but it wasn't a good enough profile to run in the national database. And then whatever happened, the detective retired, transferred, quit, and it slipped between the cracks. And the family didn't call back and say, hey, technology's moving at lightning speed. Can we retest that evidence? Because they didn't know it existed. And when they came to us, we went to JSO and we asked them to take another look at the case. They realized that this DNA had been running for years in the state system. But what happened was the guy had left the state not long after he killed Leslie, moved to Michigan, and perpetrated more crimes and was arrested and convicted and had been in prison for decades, while his DNA was running in Florida. He was in another state already in prison. So the second they reran the evidence and got a full profile, he was in CODIS because he was an inmate in another state.
That's
so
the national database.
Yeah, that's the national. So they linked him immediately. And that case, in all reality, could have probably been solved 10 years earlier had there been, methods in place to say, and Jacksonville has a lot of cold cases, but somebody's got to be able to say, make the phone call and say, hey, remember me? Hey, it's been 5 years. How has technology improved?
I mean, could have been solved 10 years ago, but probably wouldn't have been solved without the involvement of Project Cold Case.
Yeah. I mean, I hope so. I hope that we're making that kind of impact, but, and I know that family so well, and they are so appreciative of everything we've ever, done for them. But yeah, it's tough, and you don't always get that result.
And if you take the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, unfortunately, we have a fair amount of homicides. And the more you work, the better you get at working them, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And they are very good at what they do. Now, you take some small rural agencies and counties out here, they have them, maybe one or two homicides, maybe at best a year, and now all of a sudden it goes cold. Supporting that type of case makes it so much more difficult, and that's because you're having a situation where you're having a local law enforcement agency that doesn't have the resources, might not have the technology, to do the advanced DNA testing,
right?
And they're limited in what they can do in their role, and they try to exhaust everything right up front. I'd love to see the statistical numbers of how quickly these are solved based on what agencies are investigating them, especially the size of the agencies and the resources that they have.
Yeah. Well, the Cold Case Symposium, it's a project that is co-hosted by Purdue University and the University of North Florida. It's going to be at UNF on October 22nd and 23rd. But registration has begun.
Yeah, registration is open, and anybody is invited. So this is an opportunity for the public, for families that have been impacted, for law enforcement, for academics, for students. Anybody can come and watch these presentations. A lot of times the public is left out of cold case conferences, but they have an interest, and this allows an opportunity for them to come in and understand the real workings. JSO is going to be there doing a presentation. We have a local media person who you guys both know that is going to be there speaking.
Katie Jeffries.
Katie Jeffries is going to talk about how she handles families, when she's doing her Unsolved series.
Yeah.
We're going to have a mental health professional whose father was a murder victim and whose case is unsolved, and who works with us hand in hand and facilitates some of our support meetings, provides individual counseling that Project Cold Case pays for families. We'll have missing, people, organizations that worked with missing families, and Anne-Marie Schubert, who, again, as you mentioned earlier, was not only okayed the use of genetic genealogy in the Golden State Killer, but then prosecuted D'Angelo and got him to plead guilty. So that's a pretty high-profile case, and she's going to talk about the value of that technology.
Well, Ryan Backmann, Mark Baughman, thank you so much for coming on the program today. Really appreciate the work that you do.
Yeah, thank you.
So welcome.
And can I just say one thing? We also have our Year of Hope event coming up September 29th at the Intuition Ale House, which is our annual fundraiser. You can go to our website if you want more information.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much. Up next, a local election supervisor chastises voters after abysmal voter turnout in the primaries. Florida counties experienced low voter turnout in August's primary election. But for Florida, Clay County's supervisor of elections, it appears to have been a last straw. Here to discuss his reaction and what he hopes a recent letter that he wrote accomplishes is Clay County supervisor of elections, Chris Chambliss. Hey, Chris.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm glad to have you here. So this was a rather scathing letter to voters that you wrote. Tell us what it said first and what you hope to accomplish with it.
Well, it was all in love. Of course, everything that we do for ensuring that citizens of Clay County have fair, equitable, transparent elections. But in addition to that, we hope that they will take advantage of that process. And what concerned me was it was a low water mark in the past 20 years for a turnout in a presidential year primary of 19%.
19%. So that is 80% of people just chose not to participate. That's of registered voters.
That's correct.
Not just the general population.
That's correct.
So you were frustrated by this. Talk about where that frustration comes from. Is it primarily because you're concerned about the lack of participation? Is it the resources that are expended and wasted preparing for something like this?
All of the above. Of course, there is a fiscal side to this, as I mentioned in the article. You know, just election worker payroll. That's not my staff. It's just the election workers. Election workers are paid. That was $250,000 for a primary election. And while we don't want to focus on the dollar amount or a cost per vote, what we do want to say is the amount of effort that goes in to an election that was a very lackluster turnout. If you think about it this way, think about it as an Olympian who all their life prepare for that day. And they train and train and they show up to the Olympics and nobody comes to watch. Or the Super Bowl, to where you have struggled the whole year through the playoffs to make it to the Super Bowl, and you look in the stands and nobody is there but your family. And that's what I equate it to. And I don't think, yes, I know that we live in a republic, but it's a democratic process to provide the leadership in that republic. And if nobody shows up, or if very few people show up, then you have a small number of individuals that are placing the laws on the books or are placing the candidates in office, and that needs to change.
So in your letter, you called it appalling, and you said that's especially so given the availability of 45 days of vote by mail, 10 days of early voting, in addition to all the hours that are 12 hours on a primary day as well. What do you think is happening? Why do you think that that voter turnout was so poor on August 20th?
Well, I think that we have become the two sides. Number one, we've become as a nation apathetic. My vote doesn't mean anything. It won't make a change and whatnot. And that was one of the wonderful election cartoon that I placed in my article that said that my vote doesn't count. Well, the truth of the matter is the only vote that does not count is the one that's not placed. Now, the individual who you wanted to win may or may not have won, but your voice was heard, and your voice will always be heard as long as you engage into the process. But too many times we have individuals that relate whether or not their candidate wins to whether the election or their vote counted, and that is a myth that we really need to dispel.
Apathy is one thing you're saying.
Okay, so apathy is the first thing. The other thing is I think that individuals, we live busy lives. Many individuals may work multiple jobs to make ends meet, and they say, look, if it doesn't directly affect me, then I'm just going to go on with my day in living. But the truth of the matter is, ultimately, whether it's a tax that you don't agree with, whether it's a decision that your representative makes that they don't agree with, ultimately, it will impact them. Oftentimes, individuals will say, well, I didn't get to vote on this, but in fact, that they did get to vote. They did if they participated in the election for the position that the individual that made those decisions. And that's why it's very important. There are individuals that have given their life so that you can have the freedom to cast your ballot. And if you don't take advantage of that, then you're saying that ultimately that it didn't matter.
So you say apathy, and at the same time, it seems like people are more political than ever in terms of their engagement, whether it's on social media or, talking about it publicly. I feel like we hear more about politics than we care to on a good day. How does that interplay with what you're saying is voter apathy?
Well, I think it goes back to if it doesn't go your way, or if it's not ran the way that you believe, then you equate that to your voice doesn't matter. But it does, and so they sit at home. Think about this. So, just in my years that I've worked with the elections office, we now have early voting, and early voting goes for up to 2 weeks of this coming general election in Clay County, 144 hours of early voting. In addition to that, we have voting by mail, no excuse. You used to have an excuse. I'm out of town, sign an affidavit, and now you can vote by mail just because that's what you want to do. So all of these laws have made change to make it easier for you to cast your ballot, but yet it did not help.
Got a few calls I want to take. Daryl from St. Augustine, just briefly go ahead, please. Daryl, thanks.
Yes, good morning. I think you're moving in the right direction, making it easier, but if I can go on the computer and in 5 minutes transfer thousands of dollars from one location to another, there's absolutely no reason that I can't go on the computer and have my vote counted. I can do that. I can transfer money in 5 minutes. I should be able to vote in less than that. You shouldn't have to get in a car, go place, sign something up, do documents, go online. This is who I am. Boom. Confirm it.
Daryl, thanks. So what about online voting?
So many years ago, I was a part of the secure electronic registration voting experiment that we were going to use for the DOD. And what we found is while there is a way to secure the vote, there is not necessarily a way for you to ensure that the individual who is voting is in fact that individual. And so I think we're a long ways from voting online.
Just a quick call from Tim in Clay County. Tim, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So I called, I think it was a week or two ago, and asked a question about the Duval County elections official. And I asked him about the 2020 election, and he gave us an answer of, well, he wasn't sure because it was kind of iffy and shadowy and blah, blah, blah. So I assumed that from that answer that he didn't really believe in the 2020 election. So I was wondering how you felt about it. And if you don't believe that it was a legitimate election, then how could we possibly believe that, I don't know, even the election in Clay County was
Tim,
legitimate?
thank you. Go ahead, just briefly.
So real quick, I've been with the office since 2000, and the systems that conduct the elections are very, very accurate. In 2000, we had a difference of 2 votes, which came down to a marking error on that. So I believe our election systems are very, very accurate.
And you believe the 2020 election was legitimate?
Absolutely.
All right. Chris Chambliss, thanks so much for being here. Hopefully your letter has some impact.
Thank you.
Up next,
always had to navigate different constituencies, students and faculty, alumni and donors, not to mention.
Inflation may have slowed, but not everyone's happy with the economy. If you're a person who's trying to buy a home still, you're not looking at, well, things are a little better than they were 2 months ago. You're looking at, gosh, they're a lot worse than they were 3 years ago.
The On Point Money Ladies are back to talk inflation, housing, and COVID's lasting effects on the economy. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
Some degree of skepticism is healthy, but Americans' trust in each other and in our institutions is now so low that it's considered dangerous.
Today, we've quit knowing each other.
How do we tackle the crisis in trust? And what are the consequences for all of us if we don't? Join me, Jen White, for that conversation next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
The production Love, Loss, and What I Wore. It's a play by Nora and Delia Ephron, and joining me to discuss it is founder and managing director of Blue Fire Theater, Tony D'Amico. Tony,
Yes.
sorry, I'm stumbling. Not like
That's
we haven't
okay.
met before. How are you, Tony?
It's kind of like Monday today because we had
I know.
yesterday off.
Welcome back,
Yeah,
Tony.
thank you. Thanks for having us.
We're also joined by Sybil Purvis. She's founder and director of the Pinky Promise Foundation, which we will get to an explanation of in just a minute. But Tony, this is a production of this Ephron classic,
Yes.
the two Ephrons. It's a series of monologues with a cast of 5.
Mhm.
And one of the stories focuses on breast cancer
Yes, it does.
survival and,
Mhm.
and living with a diagnosis.
Mhm.
This is one of the beneficiaries of this production is breast cancer
Right.
awareness.
Correct.
Tell us about that.
So I have done this show before, Love, Loss, and What I Wore, and it is a lot of different monologues which reflect women and their clothing. Because I could probably ask you, do you have a favorite piece of clothing right now or previous piece of clothing?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you could probably describe it to me. I had one when I was like 7
Yeah.
7 or 10.
Oh.
And it was a purple turtleneck long sleeve shirt. And I had a velour pair of purple bell bottom pants.
Sweet. Wow.
So, you can describe these things, these pieces of clothing, and these stories evoke memories, heartwarming, funny, poignant. Some are a little tough. It is an adult show to a certain degree. I wouldn't have anybody under 18 come to the show, but they're so meaningful, and we have 8 women in the cast, by the way. We split it up a little bit more, so
Okay.
we're giving some more people a chance to be in the show.
And so, like a lot of Ephron stuff, it's sort of heartbreaking,
Right.
very sweet, also
Mhm.
really funny.
Mhm.
What is the goal of this production? It's benefiting a couple of local Nassau
Yes,
County
correct.
agencies.
What our goal is we wanted to do it in October for Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and I wanted to give it to a local organization that was using the funds in Nassau County and what I like to call like the tri-state area, even in Duval, because Pinky Promise will help any woman going through any kind of cancer treatment. And so they give all kinds of free services, and Sybil will talk about that in a minute. But we wanted to find a local organization that would benefit from that. So a portion of the proceeds will be going to Pinky Promise from the show. So come and buy tickets and come see it. Bring all your girlfriends. Have a night out. It is really what you would call, if it was a movie, a chick flick. It's legitimately, female driven. But gentlemen are more than welcome. Bring your husbands or leave them at home to watch football, whatever you want to do. It's fine.
Sybil, tell us, what is Pinky Promise? Where did that name come from? I think we sort of have an idea of what a Pinky Promise is, but how does it apply?
I think it just came from the fact that we will be there to support you and help you in anything that you might need. So it was a pinky promise that we would just be there for ladies as they were going through this journey.
Yeah. And so what sort of services do you provide?
Well, the ladies come in. There can be any kind of cancer. They just have to be willing to drive to visit with us because we want them to pick out products that they like. We give brand new wigs. We give brand new head coverings. We give gas cards, food cards, Starbucks cards, because there's always a Starbucks around. They can stop and get them a cake pop or a coffee or whatever. We give mastectomy camisoles if they are going through breast cancer and need that. There's all kind of handmade items that ladies make to donate to us to give back to other women, from handmade quilts to mastectomy pillows, anything. Our it's just a boutique. They come in, they bring me a current pathology report dated within the last 3 months, and all of our products are brand new and they're complimentary to them. We don't sell anything.
And is the organization, do you have a personal connection to the people who...
I do not. I'm not a survivor. I do have some girlfriends that have faced it many times. We are run by volunteers. A lot of our volunteers have gone through cancer or they have a loved one. As they say, cancer doesn't have a face until it's yours or someone you know, and we all know someone. So it was something that I wanted to do to try to give back to women. Like I say, I'm not a cancer survivor. But I just wanted to be able to help them as they were going through their journey. I was raised by 2 beauticians. My mom and dad were both beauticians.
Wow.
So I kind of was raised in a beauty shop, so I knew how important hair was.
Yeah.
So I just really wanted to give back to them, to have a place to come and pick out a wig, pick out a brand new headscarf.
Do you recommend that people make appointments?
We don't do appointments right now. So far, since the first of the year, we've visited with 40 different women, but we don't have to have appointments right now. We're open on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10 until 2. We are staffed with all volunteers, so they just need to come visit with us. They can call and any more information that they need, but as right now, we don't do appointments.
And you're located in Nassau County.
I am in Callahan, beautiful downtown Callahan, Florida.
All right.
I am.
So, Tony, for people who aren't familiar with like the Nora Ephron vibe, what are you part of this performance? Are you directing it?
No, I am. Jennifer Weber is directing it. She's our director. We have 8 women who are volunteering. We're also volunteer, by the way, are volunteering their time to share these stories that actually is from a book.
By the same name.
Yeah. It's Eileen Beckerman wrote the book of the same name. Yeah. So they took those stories and they kind of developed them and they kind of made some of their own as well.
Thank you so much for being here. Tony D'Amico, Sybil Purvis, we appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
And that's our program. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or BaptistJax.com. Amelia Island presents the Amelia Island Dance Festival September 5th to 8th, with events celebrating an extensive selection of dance genres, plus workshops designed to inspire dancers of all levels. More information at ameliaisland.com/dance.
If you have concerns about your child's reading at grade level, ask your child's teacher for ways you can help at home to get them back on track, including a list of reading level appropriate vocabulary words. For more information, readjax.org.